Hi and what's up everyone? I hope that you are all doing well. I'm here to respond to a couple of questions that have come in from last Sunday's message. As you know, we finished up our series in Ephesians. We looked at chapter 6 verses 10 and following about the spiritual warfare that we're in, the practicality of our armor, the necessity of prayerful teamwork and all the rest of it. The questions that have come in are great, and so I'm here to respond to a few of them now. One person asks this: in relation to putting on the armor, how much of it is based on our own effort? Is it entirely based on our own control in this effort, i.e. does God not intervene in the process? That's a terrific question because there can be a bit of confusion sometimes for many Christians about the role that we play in our spiritual lives, let alone spiritual warfare, and what part God plays in empowering us, equipping us, and so on. Indeed, there's often this view that God had, done the great work of rescuing us and made us, come alive in Jesus, right? We were born again, okay, that's God's part. And then the rest of it is kind of our own, or maybe it's a mixture of both, and so on and so forth. It gets a bit murky. What's to go with that? Well, it's actually very interesting that in Ephesians 6, verse 10, the first verse that we looked at in last week's sermon, verse 10 and 11 actually have two commands that govern the entire text. So in verse 10, Paul says, finally, be strengthened by the Lord and by his vast strength. Okay, so first of all, we immediately see that to be strengthened, to be given strength by God, is entirely his own initiative. It's his own strength. It's his resources. It's his work. Be strengthened, right? That's a passive word, right? Which means that we receive something. God does something in our lives. Okay, that's verse 10. However, in verse 11, it says this: put on the full armor of God so that you can stand against the schemes of the devil. All right, now that's not passive anymore, that's active, right? You've got two commands going on, verse 10 and 11, and they both seem to suggest not half, 50% God and 50% us, but that it's 100% God's work, as well as it's 100% your responsibility. In fact, this put on the full armor of God in verse 11, that's not the first time Paul has told us to put on something. If you notice back in chapter 4, we are to put on our new self. We're meant to put off our old. That's the same kind of dynamic, indeed the same kind of strength that we are to be exerting. As much as you put on the new self with godliness, you are to put on this new armor of God as well. And therefore, what I would say to that would be that we don't actually live in a world where God does half the job and the rest of it is our own doing. No, God actually, from beginning to end, from start to finish, it's all his power and his prerogative and his spirit. He leads us, he guides us, he blazes the way for us to come to the end of history, complete in Jesus and restored in him. And also, you have 100% moral responsibility, 100% culpability, if you're not doing these things, to ensure that you are living your life as a Christian, that you're putting on the armor of God as well. It is not any excuse whatsoever for Christians to be lacking in zeal or lacking in effort because God is somehow going to do it for us, or somehow our effort, it doesn't mean much in the long run. I hope that helps answers that question. Number 2, what benchmark can we use to determine whether we're doing okay in each of the 5 pieces of armor? How do we know if we've put them on correctly or put them on enough? And does this benchmark look the same for everyone? I like where this question is going, and I'll tell you why. This is a positively framed question, right? It means that you actually want to live life valiantly as a soldier. It means that you want to fight. You know the trench warfare that you're supposed to be in, and you want to make sure that you're using your armor appropriately. You want to make sure that it's practically being beneficial to yourself and also for others. I wouldn't quite use the word benchmark. I'm not sure where the benchmark idea would come from, as if there's like a standard of how we ought to be in the Christian life, and that's especially whether it's the same for everyone. All I'd say is that we know that we're doing okay in these 5 armors. If you look at them closely, they're incredibly practical. And the way that you know that you're using them is if you are using them. So truth, for example, like a belt around your waist, are you someone who is hungering for God's truth? Are you longing for God's word? Feet sandaled with readiness for the gospel of peace. In other words, are you taking the gospel out to others? Are you sharing your faith with your friends? Or in every situation, Paul says in verse 16, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. In other words, your faith, that is your trusting in God, are you putting that up during times of stress, during times of anxiety and turmoil? The way that you know that you're using the armor, the way that you know you're benefiting practically with all the spiritual armor that God gives you is whether or not you're actually using them in the day-to-day. Whether you are using them, especially when times get tough. There can be this tendency, I think, for Christians to have a lot of great head knowledge of what they ought to do. But when the rubber hits the road, when the relatives are on your back about being a Christian, when those at work are scoffing at you for believing in Jesus, there's a tendency for us to revert or to go back to things that are common sense or practical or even just downright narky. And I think that those are the times where you know that you're not using the armor appropriately. You're not using the resources that God is giving to you. God has abundantly given us his word, and he's given us the resources and the riches that we have in Jesus precisely so that you can use them in the everyday and in the day-to-day. Like I said last Sunday, Ephesians 6 finishes with such gutsy realism compared to chapter 1, where it was so glorious. And then you end up asking, well, why can't Paul be more practical? Why can't Paul tell us what this looks like? Well, there it is in chapters 4, 5, and 6. What it looks like in the home, how you relate to your spouse, how you treat your children, how you relate to your subordinates or to your earthly masters. You see, that is how you know that you are putting on the armor. That's how you know that you're putting on the new self. I hope that is helpful. One more question here, and we'll close with this. What if no matter how much effort we've tried to put on the armor, we still cannot fully utilize its functions in our weakest or most vulnerable moments and fall straight back into our old ways? Are we still considered to be soldiers, that is, legitimate Christians in this battle? That is, again, a terrific question. And I guess it speaks to the kind of sadness that can come over certain Christians for feeling that like they are losing the battle for the fight, that they are losing and giving in to temptation, that they are giving Satan a foothold in their spiritual lives, in their marriages, that they are, instead of putting on the new self, they are reverting back to their old self. So the reason why I keep switching between chapter 4 and chapter 6 is because the same putting on language is actually evident and prevalent there. I would say that everything that we have to live a godly life is there for us in the scriptures. I said at the end of the message, I think on Sunday, that the outcome of the warfare is already determined. That matters because it matters because it would tell you where your confidence would ultimately be in. You see, if the outcome was not determined, if God's promise of restoration is somehow quaky or a bit ambivalent, then spiritual warfare would be a very dicey activity indeed. You don't know whether sometimes Satan wins one round and maybe God might win one round. But that's not the way the universe works, and that's not the way Paul thinks. In Paul, God has already set the stage where history is coming to its fulfillment in Jesus. Like I said, all things are being restored. Throughout this series, we've seen that all things are coming to their restoration and their culmination in Jesus on the last day. Every Christian has been given the resources to fight valiantly, to put to death sin, to see Satan defeated. And right now, Satan, as it were, is hanging by the ropes, or as they say, he's on the ropes. He's about to be knocked out. The decisive battle has already been won at the cross. That was his definitive defeat when all the principalities and powers were smashed by Jesus' death, when everyone thought that death was the most shameful and humiliating thing for God, that was actually God's victory. Because after they've killed Jesus, they could do no more. But God vindicated him on the last day. He is now conquering. And it is in that strength and along that wave of victory that Paul can write this with confidence, instructing us to continue to fight the good fight, to put on the new self and to put off the old self and that sort of thing, you know. And so I would say that if you feel that at times you are losing or at least giving into the battle, take very seriously that there is a warning that's attached there, and that is do not behave as though the battle is lost, because if you continue along that, then it may be evident that you were not actually part of God's people to begin with, that the Spirit may not have been in you, that you would have tasted something of God's goodness, but then afterwards you had not persevered. You can be that kind of person. The Bible is actually pretty clear about those kinds of people, the people who either fall away and they don't come back, or they're terminally unrepentant, okay? But however, the largest amount of exhortation and encouragement from the scriptures is precisely in the wake of the battle that has already been won for you in Jesus. That is the fight in which Paul is now writing to us to tell us to put on that armor, to keep fighting and all the rest of it. And so practically what this looks like, I think it is to trust and to retreat back into the victory that Jesus has already won. He's already defeated those powers at the cross. And so go to him, run to him in your despair. When you fall into temptation again, run to him at the cross. Find brothers and sisters who can work alongside you in the trenches. Ask people to pray for you, but keep working at it, not because you, in order to win the victory, but because the victory is already certain. That is the power for you to keep going. Well, I hope that's helpful, and thanks for you who have submitted questions. I really enjoyed reading them and meditating on Ephesians with you, and I hope and I pray that the victory of God will be made more certain in your life this week as you take on the full armor that he has given you and fight gloriously throughout this week and indeed until he comes again. Bye for now.